Nick, Torsten, thank you for joining us. Thank you very much for your time today on this rather surprisingly eventful day. We were told not to expect any surprises. And number 10 is telling us of Sajid Javid's resignation. Nothing to see here. Move along. Totally ordinary. Nick, you were in the Treasury for many years. Is that how it feels to you as you watch today unfold?
No, clearly Mr. Javid's resignation was not expected. It wasn't in the script. It certainly hadn't been briefed. But on the one hand, these things happen in reshuffles. On the other hand, they don't normally happen to chancellors. And chancellors resigning is always quite a serious event. Obviously, Mr. Javid's resigned. Norman Lamont, I think it's fair to say, was sacked. Nigel Lawson definitely resigned. But in each of these cases, it didn't end very well for the Prime Minister.
Torsten, does this have any echoes in history, or are we looking at a rather unique moment?
I think the thing that is slightly unique about it is because chancellors do go, whether by choice or not. The unique thing is that the degree of which the timing of the going is semi by accident, I think, is unusual. The level of going into a process with a reasonably acceptably relaxed attitude to whether or not you would have a chancellor by the end of the day is unusual. Most people do not go into reshuffles in doubt about who the chancellor is coming out, and that appears to have been how we started today, and we've ended with one outcome, but that is unusual.
And what we're being told is that all number 10 wanted was a David Cameron-George Osborne relationship. Nothing to see here, perfectly normal, just two teams humming as one. But that wasn't quite how it was in those days, was it? I mean, George Osborne had his own specially selected team. Was number 10 crawling all over the budget, more or less writing it?
I think it's fair to say that in opposition, the Cameron and Osborne advisors were pretty interchangeable. They all worked on the same floor in their office. But once in Downing Street, the teams were very separate. Yes, they worked very closely together, but it was on the basis that the Treasury was there to take the lead in advising on economic issues. And it's also fair to say Cameron didn't have an economic advisor. So it was very clear where the advice was coming from. I think this is qualitatively different.
I think the other thing I think we should be careful about is, like, everyone in Westminster and other advisors loves talking about advisors as if that's the issue. Like, the relationship in David Cameron and George Osborne's teams was to do with the principles. It was to do with the relationship between David Cameron and George Osborne. The advisors, the structure of your advisors, who sits in which office, all the rest is all window dressing. Like, that's what follows from the structure of the relationship between a Prime Minister and a Chancellor, and that is what matters, which is why, if it's true that the reason he is going is because of that they made suggestions for changing individual sets of advisors, then that is a bad way to decide who your Chancellor is, because the advisors are not the issue. The issues are, you either want an individual to be your Chancellor to take the big economic decisions with you that need taking, or you don't. And it does not matter who their advisors are.
Look, it's worth recalling that Nigel Lawson resigned over Mrs Thatcher choosing to have Alan Walters as her advisor. But actually, the reason why Nigel Lawson really resigned was there was a big difference of policy. Now, in this case, I don't think it's about policy, but I think it's about the correct role and relationship between number 11 and number 10. Now, Mr Javid, as I understand it, and I'm not close to these matters, had an unfortunate experience in the summer where his advisor was marched out of Downing Street. And so to try that on a second time on a wholesale scale is basically saying, we want to be in charge and you're going to be subordinate.
That's what it comes down to, basically,
and,
isn't it?
Look, chances are subordinate, but the relationship at its best rests on a degree of creative tension. The Prime Minister's there to lead the government, to win elections, but the Chancellor and the Treasury are there occasionally to say, well, hang on a second, we ought to worry about the economy. And it is a form of check and balance. And where the relationship works well, governments tend to be very successful. But it does, I mean, they're not equals, but in a sense, the Chancellor is sort of first among equals when it comes to the rest of the cabinet. And historically, whether it was George Osborne, Gordon Brown, Ken Clarke, Nigel Lawson, they were treated in that manner.
But maybe no more, or not for the new occupants' tenancy. What implications would that have if they are trying to subordinate the Chancellor and therefore the Treasury? What could that mean?
Well, look, first, we don't know where this is going to end up. Ken Clarke always told me that after John Major had sacked Norman Lamont, it made it impossible for him to sack Ken Clarke. Now, the new guy, I don't know, by all accounts, he's a very talented guy. He may be another Ken Clarke. But actually, the current Chancellor is currently in a stronger position than Sajid Javid. He's got a budget coming up. If he were to threaten to resign, that could be really quite dangerous for Mr. Johnson. It would certainly be finishing time for Mr. Cummings, whom I suspect, in any case, as a result of what's happened today, his life expectancy in Downing Street has probably contracted a bit. But, I mean, to answer your question, if actually the deal is that he is going to be totally subordinate and take instructions from Number 10, that will have interesting consequences in the long run, because it probably means higher spending, bigger deficits, the absence of difficult decisions. Now, normally in politics, it's the first year of a parliament you take the tough decisions. Now, so far, this government, as far as I can see, has only focused on spending decisions, High Speed 2, spending more money on the health service, and so on. In a sense, the test for this regime will be, is the budget prepared to take difficult decisions to deliver on a fiscal plan?
I think we should just make it concrete. So there's two different kinds of changes that happen because of what's happened. So there's the relative power relationship between Number 10 and the Treasury, and we'd have no idea where it turns up, but the direction of travel is clearly into a weaker power for the Treasury. Who knows how far it goes, which clearly, all else equal, leads to more some more spending or a different kind of process for decision taking in the years ahead. There's more specific issues though, which is what is the big question facing this government? It'll have to decide by Christmas this year, when it's done its second budget and its spending review, how is it reconciling the wish to look like a new government, one that is in blunt spending a lot more money? Not only has austerity ended the cuts, but it feels different, as well as delivering the large increase in capital spending. And it's weighing that up against the trade-off, which is we've committed to fiscal rules which are quite tough on the current budget side, i.e. the day-to-day public service spending side, but we haven't quite accepted in our heart of hearts that although we've become a big state Conservative Party, that they haven't given up on being a low tax Conservative Party. And that is basically the underlying tension. Do you stick to these fiscal rules and put up taxes to deliver the spending increases you want to feel like a different government? Or do you in the end bottle on the tax rises and then the pressure comes back on the fiscal rule? And while that Chancellor was there who'd put that fiscal rule in place and had it accepted in the manifesto, the chance of buckling on the fiscal rule was low. The chance on that is now significantly higher. The chances of us not having the brand new set of fiscal rules that have just been put through a manifesto election lasting even the length of this year, I think has now gone up quite significantly.
But that will be quite damaging to the government's economic credibility. I mean, it's possible. My guess actually is the government will stick with those rules. It might use a bit of smoke and mirrors in order to do it, although with an independent fiscal council in the form of the Office for Budget Responsibility, that is more difficult than it was in the past. But I think to lose a Chancellor and then just to throw out some rules which were in your manifesto does raise quite serious questions about whether you're interested in having a credible economic policy.
One suggestion was that Number 10, Dominic Cummings, did want to raise some taxes now, as is traditional straight after an election if you've got the majority to do it. And it might be that maybe that's what we see a bit more of. So
I think there's clearly a difference of gung-ho-ness, about how much you're prepared to engage in controversial tax pot rises, particularly around things where elements of Number 10 may be happy to say that revenue raisers will be particularly heavy on the top, will allow them to deliver a levelling up agenda, and a Chancellor who was attached to traditionally to a low tax agenda, being in some ways understandably cautious about those individual measures. Also just being cautious because these things are complicated. Things that sound easy, like flat rate pension tax relief, have a lot of wider implications. How you do that for defined benefit pension schemes is complicated. So rightly would be saying we need to get this right. So there's definitely may have been elements of that in this package, but the bigger picture is what it is with the new Chancellor or with the old Chancellor, which is where the constraints of your fiscal rule, where do your tax revenues come from, and does that allow you to feel like a different government, or is it basically more of the same?
Just in terms of, you, as I said, you were at the Treasury for a long time, Nick. The time pressure on the new Chancellor is extraordinary, isn't it? And this is a big moment for our country, choosing a new path and the rest of it. This is not just any old budget either. New government, new majority, and he's got a matter of weeks, not many, to work out what he wants to do.
Yes, now in a sensible world, they put the budget back. You don't have to have a budget in March, you could have it in April. In fact, you don't really need a budget at all.
Although we're committed legally to 2 OBR forecasts by the end of March.
Okay.
So we're already not going to get that.
All right.
So
Okay, look, but let's assume they go ahead. I think the first question is how much the new Chancellor, as Chief Secretary to the Treasury, has been involved in discussions hitherto. So some Chancellors involve Chief Secretaries a lot. Ken Clarke thought nothing about involving all his ministers in discussions. Whether he took much notice of them was another matter. But other Chancellors, the Chief Secretary virtually found out what the budget was on the day. So I don't know, about that degree of involvement. What is certain is that it's relatively easy to take decisions out of a budget at this stage. It's relatively easy to take decisions which involve changing a tax rate. Unfortunately, the government seems to have ruled out the easy options of raising tax rates, which are far easier to deliver and actually easier to sell. Compare and contrast the 20-odd billion George Osborne raised from increasing the VAT rate to 20% with the measure to put taxes on pasties, which probably raised a few hundred million. And that's important. And it's certainly the case when it comes to complicated policies that a Chancellor really needs to have got their head around it. They need to be in a position to make the intellectual case, which is why the great tax reforming chancellors like Nigel Lawson were making a case for tax reform years out from the measures they took. Even Gordon Brown would have used a long process to begin to create a consensus in favour of a higher tax. To me, and I may be being very naive here, the idea that suddenly they're going to introduce the biggest reform to pensions in my lifetime out of thin air seems to me a remote one. Similarly, so-called mansion taxes, as Torsten will know, raise a whole lot of difficult and interesting issues. And so I would be quite surprised if, I know these things have been briefed, but I would kind of assume they were briefed if only just to show that they were thinking radical thoughts, but not to do them.
Not doing them. Not thinking radical thoughts is definitely the easy bit of the radical thoughts. So I think we're slightly different, which is they are not. I think it's very unlikely we're going to see big tax changes like that announced in firm ways in this budget. They're not going to be like, we're going to do it exactly like this tax rate, these pension rules. I think the question is, does this Chancellor have time to make his peace with announcing direction of travels that Number 10 would like him to do? And is he able to do that in a way with enough sense of where he might end up after consultations have run their course? Or does he end up feeling railroaded into announcing some things where he doesn't know where they end up, where you are basically building in tension down the line? And that is definitely a risk if he's not already been thinking through those issues. As Nick says, if he hasn't been part of those discussions today, then that is a high risk. You do not want to be announcing consultations on hard areas of tax policy if you don't know what the answer is.
But to make a sort of a narrow point, Torsten, to be able to make the budget add up, he needs to have firm proposals. Having just the idea that we're going to do something about pensions one day does not allow you to score
no, but
tax
two budgets.
increases.
That's true, but the spending review's in the autumn.
Yep.
He doesn't have to announce the total amount of spending if he doesn't want to in this budget. He can wait, and that is, I'm pretty certain, what we will end up seeing, because they are not going to get to the firm policy proposals on tax, and we will end up seeing some consultations, and then they'll come back in the autumn and announce the big stuff.
Which is, in one sense, it's a form of actually having a later budget. This just then becomes another rather insignificant signposting event, and then
with some down payments. I mean, we'll see like entrepreneurs relief. We'll see some things, but we'll see some down payments on higher taxes. But the hard stuff is all to come.
Can I just take you back to something you said, Nick, earlier about how the Treasury is this sort of bit of the brain in government that is always thinking about responsibility and not spending more than we've got. Is that what could it look like that this government, or what could this country look like if we hadn't had a Treasury like that for years? Are there countries we can point to? Because we could be moving into that sort of period if Dominic Cummings has that kind of intent and doesn't think that bit of the brain functions and just wants to neutralise it, not have it as part of the organs of government. That's a whole new dispensation, isn't it?
It's quite doable. I mean, look, this happened in this country in 1972, effectively. Edward Heath took over economic policy. He had an unelected official, Sir William Armstrong, who was described at the time as the Deputy Prime Minister, who effectively was the Prime Minister's enforcer and sort of policy lead. And Anthony Barber, who was the then Chancellor, was perhaps one of the weakest Chancellors in living memory.
Number 10 was calling all the shots.
So I think it's fair to say that during that period, Number 10 called the shots. So, I mean, there's plenty of precedents for
but
that.
with what effect?
Well, in the case of Heath's, rampant inflation. I wouldn't blame the 3-day week on...
There were some other things going on at that point as well.
There were some other things. But
things got out of control.
A failed anti-inflation policy, and a seriously difficult set of public finances, which the Labour government then inherited in '74. In one sense, it was the beginning of the downhill slope towards the IMF in '76. So, look, we're in a different world. Fortunately, these days, borrowing is very cheap, and the way the markets take revenge on profligate governments is usually through the exchange rate. And the British people, for some reason, seem amazingly relaxed about devaluation in a way which they weren't when there was a fixed exchange rate. So I think the risk for the traditional Treasury is that you cry wolf too often and too early. Nevertheless, if you carry on spending more than you raise in tax significantly over a long period, it tends to end badly, which is why in the end you need something like the Treasury. It doesn't have to be called the Treasury, but you need somebody who actually is going to worry about the public finances and in a sense represent the taxpayer, because this is also about the value for money which you get from your tax pound. And if you just spray money around, and let's face it, a lot of the difficult decisions have yet to be taken. This is the decade when demographic pressures really build up. The government has yet to take any position, as far as I can make out, on long-term care. It's made lots of commitments on spending, and at some point, somebody is going to have to prioritise.
But if you've got a neutered Treasury, and that may have been the intent, it certainly looks like it, and a Chancellor who came to office on those terms, some of the building blocks are there for the kind of chaos you're talking about.
You can't going to what something Nick said earlier, like, this is it. He's not firing another Chancellor.
No, exactly. It's easy. I think some of the reaction today is the Chancellor's been sacked. This is Johnson taking over the Treasury. I think actually this could actually rebound. In the end, the new Chancellor, if he's as good as everybody says he is, and the Treasury actually will be ultimately empowered, not necessarily in the short run, but if the Chancellor, has a clear strategy, asserts it, is persuasive, can actually go down well in the country, things could easily change. So I don't think Johnson really is that interested in running the Treasury. I mean, he's interested in announcing spending commitments which make him popular, and
you think he's just being led down
good
this,
photo opportunities.
led down this path a bit by his chief advisor?
I mean, no, I think it's always tempting to blame advisors for everything, and advisors in the end come and go. I think it's a reasonable proposition to try and create a more cohesive centre. Many prime ministers have sought this. Some have been more successful than others. But and for all I know, he may parts at a subconscious level have wanted Mr. Javid to resign. I just simply don't know.
He spent an hour trying to persuade him not to, but that doesn't preclude
that doesn't tell you anything. But you don't go into a day proposing, like, having a row with your Chancellor unless you're prepared for him to go. And if you did, you were very unwise, because
if you went into the meeting thinking your Chancellor was a genius,
you don't let them walk out because
you don't let them walk out over this. You would have found a way through.
It's just not important enough. I mean, it's madness. Who cares who the advisors are? I don't
exactly.
care.
No.
You suggested that this could, when we look back 5 years from now, whatever, look like the moment of overreach by Dominic Cummings, by the Number 10 machine. That could be how this is remembered, because it's created this moment of chaos. And it's not the beginning of his Maoist revolution, it's possibly
But advisors are dispensable
brief
in the end. All advisors who spend their time promoting themselves and becoming stars of their own drama, there's only one way this is going to end up. The only issue is when.
Aren't you assuming that things are the way they've always been in politics? And in so many bits of the landscape, they're not.
Yeah, although I think we should be a bit careful. So things are definitely different in terms of political coalitions, how elections take place, or referendums turning up rather than not turning up. Those things are different. But government isn't permanent revolution. Okay? There is a long haul, 4 years of this government. It's got a majority. Things need doing in policy terms. Yes, big changes can happen, but in the end, the constraints and the structures that exist about making change actually happen on the ground are as real as ever. They don't change because you just want them to. The ability within a government of different people sitting in different departments to have to make collective decisions together, not all just be told exactly what's going to happen, is still the same. So a lot of the constraints that drive a structure to operate like it does are still there. Yes, you can weaken individual bits of them, but the whole system will not run as one permanent revolution.
And actually, look, the governments. This is as good as it gets.
For who?
The one thing
this
for
is the golden
for
period
Mr. Johnson.
The honeymoon.
I mean, the one thing we know is that in the modern world, governments move from being popular to very unpopular incredibly quickly.
If they ever get to the popular bit.
And the point when a prime minister becomes weak, he actually has to worry about his team.
Yeah.
And at that point, advisors are easily dispensable. We've seen this. We saw it with Charlie Whelan. We saw it with Alistair Campbell. There's a point when the
indispensable suddenly
Nicholas
becomes
Timothy.
They all go
these
overboard.
people who've briefed themselves as geniuses, and everybody writes articles about how they're determining every single nook and cranny of government strategy. The wind changes. They go. Life goes on. These guys aren't elected. They are dispensable. If you're an official, you're totally dispensable. And so I think it's dangerous to be too focused on the advisors. Yes, I'm sure Mr. Cummings has been very influential. He's starred in Channel 4 dramas in the form of Mr. Cumberbatch. But, he's not going to be there in 5 years' time.
Can I just ask you about the central mission of this government as they've articulated it, levelling up, that phrase? If you were in the Treasury as they'd come back into office with their majority in December, having heard what they had to say, having looked at their manifesto and the rest of it, would you have had much of a clue what levelling up was really about? Do you think they really know what it's about?
I think they've got a perfectly reasonable objective, very similar actually to the objective of New Labour in the early 2000s, a sense that London and the South East has grown rapidly, that they want to ensure that this divergence in growth in living standards between regions is reduced. it's a sensible objective. If you want to promote social cohesion, it's a sort of objective you should be pushing forward. The problem is always the transmission mechanism. Governments since the war generally have been committed to this policy. You could argue that the Thatcher government maybe was less committed than others. You can throw money at regions, that tends not to help. You can make long-term changes, all of which are very technical and boring, but require incredible focus and attention, and a delivery unit and the Prime Minister sitting around a table and focusing on every last detail. Not because Prime Ministers actually can do this single-handedly, but it needs prioritisation. Now, it may be that this is going to be Mr. Johnson's mission, and he will see through wholesale change to the system of further education, which has defied other governments.
Torsten, you've been.
I'm a bit more. I'm a bit more positive, in the sense that, look, what have we done so far? So far, we've agreed High Speed 2 broadly. Leave aside Hawaii and stuff, but we've agreed High Speed 2. That is not the answer to regional levelling up. Whether or not you think it's a good thing or not is kind of slightly, by the by, but that's not what it actually achieves. But there are things that we know would make a difference, like intracity transport within smaller urban regions. We've seen a bus announcement that's vaguely in that direction, although relatively small in scale. We know that skills would make a difference. We know that an overhaul, which they are planning, but will need the kind of operational delivery focus Nick is talking about on T-levels and sorting out our apprenticeship system. Those things are the right kind of policy levers that are being talked about. They would make a difference over the long term. In the short term, what will they have to show for their money? Large, visible infrastructure projects in places that Conservative ministers haven't tended to turn up to in the past. So they'll be combining politically visible things with long-term policy change that, with the right delivery focus, could start to deliver change. And in the end, I think, all governments need a mission. Otherwise, they're just making 1,000 decisions without any overarching objective. That is a perfectly good mission for the country. The gaps on living standards in Britain have actually, if anything, probably been closing slightly over the recent years, but the gaps on productivity have not. And having that as your core objective that's a good thing for a government to be doing. I think, as you rightly say, most governments, with the possible exception of the 1980s, have wanted to close those gaps, but we haven't delivered on it. And I think in some areas, I don't think it's true to say efforts weren't made in lots of areas, but if we focus specifically on further education, for example, I think it is fair to say we haven't tried hard enough in the past, and it's about time we did.
But I agree with you, and I think actually quite a lot of progress has been made. If you look at the great northern cities, they are in a far better state and far more dynamic. The challenge is the northern towns, the places which aren't in city regions.
And they come into different categories. These towns, many different categories,
Rotherham, Barnsley, Blackburn is far more difficult if you don't have a university to drive innovation and to attract a broader range of people into the area, including entrepreneurs.
Are some of them actually unreachable, so to speak?
No, look,
you can't turn some places around.
I don't think you can cut these places off. You shouldn't be defeatist. And there have been a huge number of experiments over the years, some more successful than others. So I think if I was there, I would be wanting to really try and produce the best evidence of what, of what works.
Evidence.
No, just because there have been a lot of experiments over the time. When governments have a lot of money, they tend to spray it around. But there have been periods actually when resources have been pretty constrained. But as Torsten says, you can focus on particular transport schemes and so on. And I agree with Torsten. I think on infrastructure, particularly railways, I think the North has lost out. And look, the decision's been made on High Speed 2, and I don't want to go on about it.
You say that, Nick.
But it doesn't...
We're definitely going to be going on about it. It doesn't get built till 2035. We've got years of going on about it.
But I am. But it's not... It doesn't take a lot of the resource which is available. And what worries me is if you're really serious about prioritising it, I probably wouldn't have wanted to put all my eggs in the High Speed 2 basket.
There's just a bit of optimism on this, okay? Another thing to say, what is really hard, there are hard questions in economic geography about places that are totally disconnected. All I would say is Britain is a small country, and England in particular is a small country. There are very few places that it is totally impossible that are not part of a broader ecosystem. So I think we should be like, there's too much of people saying, oh look, Midwest America, the middle of nowhere, it's really hard for these places. We've seen big population falls in some mid-American cities, Trump and other things. I think we should be really careful. That is not what Britain looks like. Britain is a small country, places can be connected, opportunity can be spread in a way that is much harder to do in a big country.
Torsten, I should ask you about the report you just produced, your think tank here produced this week about those seats, those voters that helped Boris Johnson to this majority. What do we know about what they'd like from this Chancellor? Does it make? Well, I think they won't be giving a damn whether it's Sajid Javid or Rishi Sunak.
I think that's a fair statement. But it's not for me to say what they would want. I mean, in terms of what they want, people should go and ask them what they want. In terms of what does economic data tell us about those places rather than the individual voters? And what it tells us is that a lot of the myths about them are misplaced. So it is not true that these are the oldest places in Britain. Most of the seats that switch from the Labour to the Conservatives are middle-aged seats. They're pretty much spot on the national average. They are not the poorest places in Britain, although most of them are in the north, so they're below average income, but they are not the poorest parts of the north of England. They're the middle income parts of the north. And more importantly, it is not true to say they've been declining historically all the time. Their relative decline is broadly a post-2010 feature, and I would be worried if I was in those seats looking at slower employment growth since the financial crisis, a slightly bigger pay squeeze since then, house prices growing at half the rate in these seats as compared to the rest of the country. And the most important thing I think to take away from the research work is that it is the story that is young people are all leaving these seats and moving to London is the opposite of the truth. These seats are defined by much lower rates of young people moving out of them, and also much lower rates of people moving into them, either from other parts of the UK or from abroad, so it's lower migration rates. And the combination of those two is creating a demographic kind of stasis, which is different to the rest of the country. And actually, if I took one thing away that policymakers need to think much harder about, it's that. The problem with these seats is not people leaving, it is that they are less connected to the country more generally, either whether people leave or whether people come into them, and that does mark them out, and that is not what policy has an answer to.
The sun's gone down on this extraordinary reshuffle day. What will the mood be like in the Treasury tonight?
I think slightly confused. Unexpected changes in chancellors are always difficult to respond to. You think you've got a plan, you've got a budget in a few weeks' time, and suddenly the main man's gone. You got someone new now. It's great he's in the Treasury, so that's a start. I'm trying to remember the last person. I think John Major went to number 10. Yep. Norman Lamont stepped up to being Chancellor. That was something you could cope with. Norman had been there for years, had done several jobs. But and I think there'll just be a degree of uncertainty about the future. But I think,
but also about intent, surely.
About intent. But
what was number 10 up to?
But if you work in the Treasury, you're used to rationalising adversity, and so I think the first response will be, well, look, we've got to make this work. We've got to adjust to the new modus operandi. But there'll be an underlying view also that, look, in the long run, the pendulum will swing.
We're indestructible.
And this will sort itself out.
There is also important to have some perspective. Like, how individuals feel on the day of a slightly chaotic reshuffle is important. What really matters is the big decisions. How much are we spending? What are we taxing? What are we borrowing as a country? And how serious do we look as a nation? That is the big things that matters. That's what people in the Treasury in the end care about. Yes, confusion, a slight anxiety about the process that's got us here, but in the end, give it a few weeks, and what matters is the big decisions. They'll be taking those in the budget, and they'll be taking them in the second budget in this autumn.
Exactly.
And that is what we should focus on.
Exactly. I mean, I wouldn't even give it a few weeks. I think about sort of 24 hours, 48 hours. You settle down. Chancellors come and go.
It turns out.
Prime Ministers come and go. If you're a permanent official, you just have to work with all of them, and you do the best you can.
That's a good lesson for life. Do the best you can.
Both, thank you very much indeed for sparing your time.